The rotting floorboards of the abandoned Colorado mountain cabin groaned under Frank Morrison's boots as he surveyed his retirement project. 40 years as a telephone company lineman had taught him to spot structural problems, but nothing had prepared him for what lay beneath the warped kitchen floor. When his crowbar punched through a suspicious soft spot, it revealed not water damage, but a carefully concealed trapdoor. The hidden basement contained stacks of classified government documents, surveillance photos dating back to the 1960s, and detailed maps marking locations across 3 states. Frank's hands trembled as he recognized names: politicians, business leaders, people who'd shaped the country's destiny. But it was the final discovery that made his blood run cold, his own personnel file, thick with photos and records spanning his entire career, marked with a single word: asset. Someone had been watching him for 4 decades. Someone knew he'd find this place, but why had they wanted him to discover their secrets? And what did they expect him to do with them? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank dropped the file as if it had burst into flames, photographs scattering across the dusty concrete floor. His weathered face stared back at him from dozens of images: climbing telephone poles in downtown Denver, sitting in his truck during lunch breaks, even walking his late wife Margaret to church on Sunday mornings. The shots spanned decades, the quality improving from grainy black and white to crisp color prints. His legs gave out, and he sank onto a wooden crate that served as makeshift furniture in the underground room. The cabin above had been a steal at $12,000, too good to be true, according to his daughter Sarah. She'd warned him about buying property sight unseen from an online auction, but Frank had been drawn to the listing's mention of extensive renovation opportunities and the seller's curious insistence on a cash-only transaction. Now he understood why the previous owner had been so eager to sell. Frank forced himself to examine the personnel file more carefully. The documents chronicled his entire career with Mountain Bell, later acquired by AT&T. Every job assignment, every location where he'd installed or repaired lines, every security clearance for government buildings, all of it meticulously documented. What chilled him most were the margin notes in red ink, written in a precise hand that analyzed his personality, his reliability, his potential usefulness. Subject demonstrates exceptional technical skills and unquestioning adherence to protocol. Read one assessment from 1987. Access to telecommunications infrastructure makes him valuable for future operations. Frank's mind reeled. He'd always taken pride in his work ethic, his ability to restore phone service during emergencies, his security clearance that let him work on sensitive government installations. He'd climbed poles during blizzards, crawled through underground tunnels, and repaired critical communication lines that kept the country connected. But apparently, someone had seen his dedication as something else entirely. The maps spread across a metal table showed the 3-state region where he'd worked throughout his career. Red pins marked specific locations: government buildings, military installations, corporate headquarters. Blue pins indicated telecommunications infrastructure points. Frank recognized many of the sites. He'd installed or maintained equipment at most of them. A manila envelope marked Phase 3 contained surveillance photos of other people, men and women he didn't recognize, but who appeared to be in similar technical professions. Each had their own color-coded pins on duplicate maps. Each had their own assessment files. The basement felt smaller with each passing minute, the weight of 4 decades of deception pressing down like the mountain itself. Frank had spent his retirement planning to fix a few broken windows and patch some roof shingles. Instead, he'd stumbled into what appeared to be the nerve center of a surveillance operation that had monitored him since his 20s. A sound from above made him freeze, the distinctive creak of the cabin's front porch steps. Someone was approaching the house. Frank quickly gathered the photos of himself, shoving them back into the file. His hands shook as he tried to organize the scattered documents, but there were too many, and footsteps were now moving across the main floor. Heavy boots, deliberate and measured, as if the visitor knew exactly where to go. The trapdoor above cast a square of fading daylight into the basement. Frank looked around desperately for another exit, but found only solid concrete walls. He was trapped in a room that wasn't supposed to exist, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy he didn't understand, with nowhere to run. The footsteps stopped directly above him. Frank held his breath, clutching his own file against his chest. After 40 years of steady, predictable work, of following orders and maintaining equipment, of believing he was just another anonymous government contractor, he'd discovered that nothing about his life had been anonymous at all. The question now was whether whoever had orchestrated this wanted him alive to see what came next. The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of the cabin, casting long shadows across the warped floorboards. Frank had slept surprisingly well on his inflatable mattress, despite the symphony of settling wood and scurrying creatures that had serenaded him throughout the night. He'd brought instant coffee and a camping stove, figuring creature comforts could wait until he got the electricity sorted out. As he sipped his bitter coffee from a chipped mug, Frank surveyed his domain with fresh eyes. Yesterday's excitement had given way to the sobering reality of what he'd purchased. The cabin was a disaster, but it was his disaster. At 67, he'd learned that ownership of anything, even something broken, beat the hell out of renting a sterile apartment in Phoenix. He pulled out the notebook he'd brought and began making a list. New roof, plumbing overhaul, windows that actually kept the weather out, electrical work that wouldn't burn the place down. The list grew longer with each room he examined, but Frank found himself whistling anyway. This was exactly the kind of project that would keep his hands busy and his mind off Ellen's absence. The kitchen proved to be in worse shape than he'd initially thought. The sink had pulled away from the wall, revealing a dark gap that promised expensive surprises. When Frank knelt down and peered behind it with his flashlight, he could see that the previous owners had attempted their own plumbing repairs with what appeared to be duct tape and prayers. "Jesus," he muttered, playing the beam across a tangle of pipes that defied both logic and building codes. Some genius had connected copper to galvanized steel without proper fittings, creating a corrosion nightmare that had probably been leaking for years. It was then that his flashlight beam caught something odd. Behind the mess of pipes, the wall didn't look right. The wood paneling that covered the kitchen walls continued behind the sink, but there was a vertical line where the grain didn't match. Frank leaned closer, his bad knee protesting against the concrete floor. The line was too straight to be natural, too precise to be accidental. It looked like a seam. Frank's pulse quickened as he traced the line with his flashlight. It ran from floor to ceiling, about 2 feet to the left of the sink. When he shifted position and angled the light differently, he could make out what might be another vertical line, roughly 18 inches away from the first. A door, hidden behind 30 years of amateur plumbing and deliberate concealment. He spent the next hour carefully disconnecting the sink, grateful for the decades he'd spent maintaining equipment in the Air Force. The shut-off valves were corroded, but they still turned. Water that smelled like rust and something worse gurgled out of the pipes as he worked. With the sink finally removed and set aside, Frank could see the hidden door clearly. It had been painted over multiple times, and someone had driven several long screws through the frame into the wall studs, but it was definitely a door. The hinges were on the right side, barely visible under layers of paint. Frank retrieved his toolbox from the truck and selected a cordless drill. The screws came out easily once he found the right bit, but they were long, at least 4 inches. Someone had really wanted this door to stay closed. His hands trembled slightly as he worked. This wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was something deeper. In his 30 years of military service and 20 years of marriage, Frank had developed a sixth sense for when things weren't quite right. This felt like classified files and midnight briefings, like secrets that people killed to protect. The last screw clattered to the floor, and Frank set down the drill. The door was free now, held closed only by decades of paint seal and his own hesitation. Whatever was behind it had been hidden deliberately, carefully, and permanently. The fact that someone had gone to such lengths suggested it was either very valuable or very dangerous. Probably both. Frank placed his palm against the door and pushed gently. The paint seal cracked with a sound like breaking bones, and the door swung inward on hinges that squealed in protest. Stale air rushed out, carrying the smell of old paper and something chemical he couldn't identify. He raised his flashlight and peered inside. The hidden room was small, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with no windows. Built-in shelves lined 3 walls, and they were packed with boxes, files, and equipment that looked decades old. In the center of the room sat a metal desk with something covered by a canvas tarp. Frank stepped inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't some forgotten storage space or bootlegger's hideout. This was an office, and judging by the government-issue filing cabinets and the faded security classification stamps visible on some of the documents, it was an office that had never officially existed. He pulled the tarp away from the desk and immediately wished he hadn't. The hidden room smelled of old paper and something else Frank couldn't quite identify. Something chemical, like developing fluid from the dark rooms of his youth. He'd managed to pry open the concealed door behind the bookshelf completely, revealing a space roughly 8 feet square that had been carved directly into the mountain rock. His flashlight beam swept across the walls, illuminating what looked like a makeshift office frozen in time. A metal desk sat against the far wall, its surface covered with manila folders and loose papers held down by a paperweight shaped like a miniature Washington monument. Filing cabinets lined one side, their drawers slightly ajar as if someone had left in a hurry. Frank stepped inside, his boots crunching on something scattered across the floor. He aimed his light downward and saw dozens of black and white photographs, some face up, others scattered like fallen leaves. He knelt and picked up the nearest one, a grainy image of men in suits standing beside what appeared to be military vehicles. The photo was dated November 20th, 1963, just 2 days before Kennedy was shot in Dallas. His hands trembled as he gathered more photographs. Groups of men he didn't recognize, meeting in what looked like government buildings. License plates, hotel receipts, a photograph of a young woman walking down a street taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Each image was meticulously labeled on the back with dates, times, and locations in precise handwriting. The desk drawers were unlocked. Frank pulled open the top one and found it crammed with correspondence. Letters, telegrams, and carbon copies of typewritten reports. The letterhead on one caught his attention immediately. Central Intelligence Agency. The date was December 15th, 1963, less than a month after Dallas. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his voice echoing in the small space. The letter was addressed to someone identified only as Mountain Pine, obviously a code name. Frank's eyes scanned the contents, picking out phrases that made his blood run cold: asset elimination, evidence disposal, secondary targets, and plausible deniability maintained. He opened another drawer and found maps, detailed topographical surveys of the surrounding mountain region, marked with red X's and notations in the same careful handwriting. One notation caught his eye: primary cache, grid 47B, 200 yards northeast of structure. Another read: emergency extraction route, Bear Creek Trail to Highway 7. In the bottom desk drawer, wrapped in oiled cloth, he found a.38 revolver and 3 boxes of ammunition. The gun was clean and well maintained, despite having sat here for decades. Beside it was a passport, United States of America, issued to Harold Winters, with a photograph that showed a thin man with sharp features and cold eyes. The passport was stamped with entries to Mexico City, Montreal, and surprisingly, Moscow. Frank's hands shook as he unwrapped another bundle from the same drawer. Inside were stacks of cash, hundreds of $50 and $100 bills, far more money than Frank had ever seen in one place. But these weren't modern bills. The serial numbers and design marked them as currency from the early 1960s. He counted quickly and estimated at least $20,000, maybe more. A manila envelope marked insurance in red ink contained what appeared to be copies of official documents, memos from the FBI, CIA, and other agencies Frank didn't recognize. One document, stamped eyes only, detailed something called Operation Mountain Pine and referenced post-Dallas cleanup protocols. The signature at the bottom was illegible, but the title underneath read Deputy Director of Operations. A sound from outside the cabin made Frank freeze. A car engine, getting closer. He quickly switched off his flashlight and listened. The engine stopped, and he heard a car door slam. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Frank's mind raced. He'd told no one where he was going today. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Whoever was approaching the cabin wasn't here by accident, and Frank had a sinking feeling that his discovery of this room wasn't as random as he'd initially thought. He grabbed the gun from the desk drawer, checked that it was loaded, and quietly made his way back toward the main cabin, leaving the hidden door slightly ajar behind him. He'd made a decision somewhere around 4 a.m. Whatever secrets this cabin held, he was going to uncover them systematically, methodically, the same way he'd approached everything in his 30-year career as an electrician. No rushing, no panic, just careful, deliberate work. Frank pulled on his work gloves and grabbed the flashlight. The hidden space was roughly 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep, carved directly into the mountain stone. As he squeezed through the opening, the temperature dropped noticeably. His breath formed small clouds in the beam of his flashlight. The metal filing cabinet dominated the cramped space, but Frank noticed other details now. Heavy-duty electrical conduit ran along one wall, though it appeared to have been disconnected years ago. Ventilation grates near the ceiling suggested this room had been designed for extended occupancy. Most unsettling were the anchor points bolted into the stone walls, heavy metal rings that could have secured almost anything. He approached the filing cabinet with the reverence of an archaeologist. The top drawer stuck initially, then gave way with a metallic screech that echoed in the confined space. Inside, manila folders hung in perfect order, each labeled with cryptic alphanumeric codes: Operation Mockingbird, MB-847, Project Paperclip, PP-223, COINTELPRO Extensions, CE-156. Frank's hands shook as he pulled out the first folder. The documents inside bore official letterheads he recognized: FBI, CIA, Department of Defense, but the dates made no sense. These operations were supposed to have ended decades ago, yet the papers in his hands were dated as recently as 1995. Photos spilled from one folder, men in expensive suits meeting in shadowy locations, their faces circled in red ink with handwritten notes in the margins. One photograph stopped him cold, a younger version of Senator Richard Holbrooke, now a prominent figure in presidential politics, shaking hands with a man Frank didn't recognize. The notation read, RH confirms funding continuation, Bolivia assets secured. A loose document caught his attention, typed on official CIA letterhead, but lacking any classification markings. It detailed something called Project Echo Valley, a long-term operation to monitor and manipulate domestic political movements through strategic elimination of key figures. The cabin's location was referenced multiple times as a safe house and document repository. Frank's chest tightened as he read names he recognized from history books: activists, journalists, and politicians who had died in accidents or suicides during the 1980s and 90s. Beside each name was a coded notation and a date that corresponded eerily with their actual deaths. The second drawer contained more recent materials: surveillance photos of ordinary-looking people going about their daily lives, their activities meticulously documented. Bank statements, phone records, family photographs, all bearing the same red circles and cryptic annotations. These weren't famous figures, but regular citizens whose only apparent crime was asking inconvenient questions or supporting the wrong causes. In the bottom drawer, Frank found something that made his blood run cold: a detailed file on himself. His military service record, employment history, financial statements, even photos of his house in Denver. A sticky note attached to the front read, "Potential security risk. Monitor for unusual activity post-purchase." They knew. Whoever they were, they had known he would buy this cabin, known he would eventually find this room. The thought that he'd been under surveillance, that his retirement plans had somehow been anticipated and planned for, made him feel sick. Frank's flashlight beam caught something else, a small digital camera mounted in the corner of the hidden room, its red recording light blinking steadily. His discovery hadn't gone unnoticed. Even now, someone, somewhere, was watching him rifle through these devastating secrets. He grabbed as many files as he could carry and backed out of the room, his mind racing. The isolation he'd craved for his retirement now felt like a trap. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, the main road another 3 miles beyond that. His cell phone had no signal, and the landline he'd planned to have installed wouldn't be connected for another week. As Frank spread the documents across his kitchen table, patterns began emerging. Operation Echo Valley wasn't a relic of the Cold War. It was an ongoing shadow program that had evolved and adapted over decades. The cabin wasn't just a safe house, it was an operational hub for activities that would topple governments if exposed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the old cabin creak ominously. Frank looked at the damning evidence spread before him and realized his quiet retirement had just become a race for survival. Someone would come for these files, and when they did, they wouldn't leave witnesses. Frank's coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he couldn't tear himself away from the documents spread across his kitchen table. The manila folder had contained more than just photographs. There were typed reports, handwritten notes, and what appeared to be official government correspondence, all bearing dates from 1963 to 1965. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up a memorandum marked classified in red ink. The letterhead read Office of Strategic Services with a subnotation he didn't recognize. The document detailed something called Operation Clearwater, a name that meant nothing to him, but the implications made his stomach churn. According to the memo, Clearwater involved the systematic elimination of witnesses to an unspecified event that had occurred in Dallas. Frank's breath caught. Dallas, 1963. The date alignment wasn't coincidental. He reached for another document. This one, a handwritten list of names with check marks beside most of them. Frank counted 23 names total. 21 had neat red X's drawn through them, dated between November 1963 and March 1965. Only 2 names remained unmarked, Margaret Henley and James Morrison. Frank pulled the photograph closer to the lamp. The woman leaning against the cabin's porch rail, could she be Margaret Henley? And if so, what had she witnessed that required such extreme measures? A floorboard creaked upstairs. Frank froze, listening. The mountain wind often caused settling sounds, but this was different, deliberate, measured. Someone was walking around his bedroom. Moving as quietly as his 67-year-old joints would allow, Frank gathered the documents and shoved them back into the folder. He needed to hide them, but where? The hidden room was too obvious now. If someone had found the cabin, they likely knew about the secret compartment. Another creak, this time moving toward the staircase. Frank's eyes darted around the kitchen. The old wood stove, its firebox would work temporarily. He stuffed the folder inside just as footsteps began descending the stairs. Grabbing his cold coffee mug, he forced himself to sit casually at the now empty table. "Evening, Frank." The voice was calm, almost friendly, but it made Frank's skin crawl. A man in his 50s appeared in the kitchen doorway, average height, unremarkable features, wearing a dark jacket that looked expensive. Everything about him screamed federal agent, from his polished shoes to his calculating stare. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Frank kept his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Agent Richardson, Department of Homeland Security." The man didn't offer identification, didn't extend his hand. "We need to talk about what you found in that room." Frank took a sip of cold coffee, buying time. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean. This is private property, by the way. I didn't invite you in." Richardson smiled without warmth. "The hidden compartment behind your basement wall, The one you discovered 3 days ago." He moved closer, and Frank caught the outline of a shoulder holster beneath the man's jacket. "We know you removed certain materials." "Materials?" Frank forced confusion into his voice. "Look, if you're really a federal agent, I'd like to see some identification. Otherwise, I'm calling the sheriff." "Sheriff is 40 minutes away, Frank, and cell service up here is spotty at best." Richardson pulled out a chair and sat down uninvited. "Let's not make this complicated. You've stumbled into something much bigger than an old man's retirement project. Return what you took, and we can all pretend this never happened." Frank met the man's stare. "I found some old newspapers and mouse droppings, not exactly national security material." "Margaret Henley was a photographer," Richardson said quietly, watching Frank's reaction. "She had an unfortunate habit of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, capturing images that certain people preferred remain unseen." Despite himself, Frank's eyes flickered toward the wood stove. Richardson caught the tell immediately. "You know, Frank, 21 people died to keep those secrets buried. 21 witnesses who couldn't keep their mouths shut." Richardson stood slowly. "Margaret thought she was clever, hiding copies of her work. Took us 3 years to track down this cabin after she died in that car accident." "Car accident?" "Icy roads. Terrible shame. Of course, that was 1967. We've gotten much more sophisticated since then." Richardson moved toward the wood stove. "Heart attacks look so natural in men your age, all that stress from home renovation projects." Frank's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "You're threatening me. I'm offering you a choice." Richardson opened the firebox and pulled out the manila folder. "Forget what you've seen. Sell this place to one of my associates. They'll pay well above market value. Take your profit and find a nice retirement community in Florida." "And if I refuse?" Richardson tucked the folder inside his jacket. "Then you become name number 22 on a very old list." The agent moved toward the kitchen door, then paused. "You have 48 hours to decide, Frank. I'd suggest using them wisely." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Frank alone with the terrible certainty that his quiet mountain retirement had just become a fight for his life. Frank's hands trembled as he held the yellowed photograph under the harsh LED light he'd strung up in the hidden room. The image showed a group of men in suits standing around what appeared to be a large wooden crate. The backdrop was unmistakably the same concrete walls that surrounded him now, though the room looked different, cleaner, more organized, with military-style equipment lining the shelves. He recognized one face immediately. The young man on the far left bore an unmistakable resemblance to someone he'd seen countless times in history books and old newsreels. The same prominent jaw, the piercing eyes, the confident stance that would later become iconic. But this photograph was dated November 1963, and according to everything Frank knew about history, that man should have been dead by then. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Frank barely noticed. He'd been methodically going through each box, each folder, each scrap of evidence that painted an increasingly impossible picture. Radio transcripts that shouldn't exist. Financial records showing massive fund transfers to numbered accounts. And names, so many names of people who were supposed to be heroes, patriots, leaders of the free world. The sound of gravel crunching outside made Frank freeze. He clicked off the LED light and held his breath, listening. A car door slammed, then another. Footsteps approached the cabin, deliberate and unhurried. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized he'd made a crucial mistake. His truck was parked right outside, announcing his presence to anyone who cared to look. "Mr. Castellano?" a voice called from outside. Male, authoritative, with just a hint of southern accent. "We know you're in there. We'd like to have a conversation." "We're not here to hurt you," the voice continued. "We just need to discuss what you've found." The casual tone was somehow more terrifying than if they'd been shouting threats. Frank looked around the hidden room, calculating his options. The entrance was too narrow to close quickly, and even if he could, these people clearly knew about the room's existence. The concrete walls that had seemed like protection now felt like a tomb. He grabbed the most damning documents, The photograph, a file labeled Operation Mindbridge, and what appeared to be a confession letter written in shaky handwriting. Stuffing them inside his jacket, Frank crept toward the main room of the cabin. Through the grimy window, he could see two figures. A tall man in a dark coat stood near the front door, while another person, Frank couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, circled around toward the back of the cabin. They moved with military precision, covering exits like they'd done this before. Frank's construction background kicked in. The cabin might be decrepit, but he'd already identified its weak points during his initial inspection. The floorboards near the back bedroom were partially rotted, and underneath was a crawl space that connected to an old root cellar. If he could get there without being seen, he might be able to work his way around to where he'd hidden his spare truck keys under a rock near the woodshed. The front door handle rattled. "Mr. Castellano, we're coming in now. Please don't do anything that might complicate this situation." Frank dropped to his knees and pried up the loose floorboard he'd noticed on his first day. The wood groaned in protest but gave way. He squeezed through the opening just as he heard the front door open with a sharp crack of splintering wood. The crawl space was barely 3 feet high and thick with decades of dust and spider webs. Frank army crawled through the darkness, trying to remember the layout of the cabin's foundation. His jacket caught on exposed nails and his knees scraped against rough concrete, but he forced himself to keep moving. Behind him, he could hear voices and footsteps as the intruders searched the main cabin. How long before they found the hidden room? How long before they realized he wasn't there? Frank reached what he hoped was the root cellar entrance. His fingers found the wooden door, swollen with moisture and age. He pushed against it, panic rising as it refused to budge. The voices above grew louder, more urgent. "Sir, he's not in the main structure. Should we check the—" "Find him." Frank threw his shoulder against the root cellar door. It burst open with a sound like a gunshot, and he tumbled out into the cold mountain air. No time to worry about noise now. He sprinted toward the woodshed, his 67-year-old legs protesting every step. The spare keys were exactly where he'd left them. Frank's hands shook as he started the truck, not bothering with headlights as he gunned the engine and tore down the mountain road into the darkness. The drive down the mountain felt like descending into another world. Frank's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter with each mile, the manila envelope on the passenger seat seeming to pulse with dangerous energy. He'd barely slept after discovering the hidden room, spending most of the night staring at photographs that shouldn't exist and reading documents that painted a picture so disturbing he'd questioned his own sanity. But the evidence was real. The photographs of Senator William Morrison meeting with known Soviet operatives in 1963. The detailed financial records showing payments from shell corporations with ties to Moscow. The handwritten notes in Morrison's own script outlining plans to influence key congressional votes on defense spending and foreign policy. Morrison, who'd gone on to become Secretary of Defense under 3 presidents, whose hawkish public stance on communism had made him a national hero. Frank pulled into the parking lot of the Pineview Public Library, a modest brick building that served the scattered mountain communities. He needed to research Morrison's background, to understand the full scope of what he'd uncovered. More importantly, he needed to figure out who else might know about the cabin's secrets. Inside, the elderly librarian directed him to a computer terminal with internet access. Frank's fingers moved awkwardly across the keyboard. Technology had never been his strong suit, but he managed to pull up articles about Morrison's career. Born in 1925, the man would be in his late 90s now, if he was still alive. A quick search revealed that Morrison had died 2 years ago, taking whatever secrets he harbored to the grave. But Frank's blood chilled as he read further. Morrison's son David was currently a federal judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, widely rumored to be on the short list for the Supreme Court. The family's political dynasty had endured, built on a foundation of lies and treason. Frank printed several articles, feeding quarters into the ancient machine. As he waited for the pages to emerge, a shadow fell across his table. He looked up to see a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed despite the casual mountain setting. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent Frank couldn't place. "I couldn't help but notice you're researching Senator Morrison. I'm working on a historical project about Cold War politics. Perhaps we could share resources?" Every instinct Frank had developed during his 30 years as a contractor screamed danger. People didn't just happen to be researching obscure politicians in tiny mountain libraries. He forced a smile and shook his head. "Just doing some reading for a book club," he said, casually closing the browser window. "Nothing too exciting." The woman's eyes flickered to the printer where Morrison's photo was visible on the emerging pages. "Of course. Well, if you change your mind." She walked away, but Frank noticed she didn't sit down anywhere else in the library. Instead, she browsed the fiction section near the entrance, positioning herself where she could watch him. Frank gathered his papers and headed for the exit, but not before noting the woman's license plate through the window, a black sedan with government plates. His truck felt exposed as he drove through town, checking his mirrors constantly. The black sedan stayed back, but it was there, maintaining a careful distance. Frank's mind raced through possibilities. Had someone been monitoring the cabin? Was there surveillance equipment he'd missed, or had his research triggered some kind of digital alert? He took a circuitous route back toward the mountain, making several unnecessary turns through residential streets. The sedan followed, no longer bothering to hide its presence. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the full implications of his situation. Whatever Morrison had been involved in, people were still willing to kill to keep it secret. At a stop sign, Frank made a split-second decision. Instead of turning toward his cabin, he drove straight to the sheriff's office. The black sedan couldn't follow him there without raising questions. He parked directly in front of the building and sat for several minutes watching. The sedan drove past without stopping, but Frank glimpsed the woman's face through the tinted windows. She was talking into a phone, her expression grim. Sheriff Tom Brennan was in his office, looking up with surprise as Frank entered. They'd met briefly when Frank first moved to the area, the sheriff making his standard welcome to the community visit. "Frank, right? Everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Tom, if someone wanted to hurt me, would I be safe here in town?" The sheriff's expression sharpened immediately. "What kind of threat are we talking about? Has someone made contact with you?" Frank glanced toward the window, where normal small-town life continued its peaceful rhythm, but he knew that peace was an illusion. Somewhere out there, people were deciding his fate, weighing the value of decades-old secrets against the life of one retired contractor who'd stumbled into the wrong hidden room. Frank's hands trembled as he spread the documents across his kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light. The manila folder had contained more than he'd initially realized. Dozens of photographs, typed reports, and handwritten notes that painted a picture so disturbing he had to pause every few minutes to catch his breath. The black and white photographs showed groups of men in military uniforms standing beside what appeared to be scientific equipment. In several images, he could make out figures in white coats working with large metal containers marked with symbols he didn't recognize. The most chilling photo showed a row of hospital beds, each occupied by a motionless figure, with medical personnel taking notes nearby. One typewritten report bore the letterhead Project Blackwater, classification level 5, and was dated September 15, 1952. Frank adjusted his reading glasses and squinted at the cramped text. Subject group responded favorably to compound BW47 in initial trials. Memory suppression achieved in 89% of participants within 72 hours of administration. Recommend proceeding to Phase 3 with expanded test population. Dr. Morrison requests additional funding for psychiatric evaluation protocols. Frank's coffee grew cold as he read report after report detailing human experiments conducted on unwitting subjects. The documents referenced multiple locations across 3 states, but his mountain region appeared to be a primary testing site. Names of local residents, people whose families he might know, appeared on lists marked selected for Protocol B. A handwritten note in faded blue ink caught his attention. The penmanship was careful, deliberate. August 3rd, Jenkins and I witnessed disposal of subjects 23 to 31, at the ravine site. Cannot continue to be party to this. Have removed key documentation as insurance. If discovered, materials hidden at safe house coordinates 40.7589 degree N, 74.0060 degree W. God forgive us all. RM. Frank grabbed a pen and copied down the coordinates. His cabin's location wasn't far from those numbers. Someone had used his property as a hiding place for evidence of government experiments on American citizens. The sound of gravel crunching in his driveway made him freeze. He quickly gathered the documents, shoving them back into the folder as headlights swept across his kitchen window. Frank killed the lights and peered through the curtains. A dark sedan sat in his driveway, engine running, but he couldn't make out the occupants in the darkness. After 10 minutes that felt like hours, the car backed out and disappeared down the mountain road. Frank remained motionless for another 20 minutes before turning the lights back on. His hands shook as he poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Frank was hammering loose boards on his front porch when a woman in her 70s approached on foot. She was thin, with silver hair pulled back in a bun, and walked with the determined gait of someone accustomed to mountain terrain. "You're the fellow who bought the Morrison place," she said without preamble. Frank set down his hammer. "Frank Castellano. And you are?" "Beth Reeves. I live about 2 miles up the ridge." She studied his face carefully. "Known the Morrison family for 60 years. Watched Robert build that cabin with his own hands back in '49. "Robert Morrison?" Frank tried to keep his voice casual. "The previous owner?" "Previous owner's father. Robert died in 1953. Car accident, they said, though his boy never believed it. Beth's eyes were sharp, alert. Found it curious that someone would finally buy this place after all these years. Most folks around here won't go near it." Frank gestured toward the porch steps. "Would you like to sit? Maybe you could tell me more about the history of this place." Beth remained standing. "Depends on what you found." The directness of her statement caught Frank off guard. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Robert Morrison was my husband's cousin. Good man. Worked for the government during the war, then came back here thinking he could live quietly in the mountains." Beth's voice carried decades of anger. "Instead, he got caught up in something that killed him. Frank made a decision that would change everything. Would you like some coffee?" "I think we need to talk." 20 minutes later, Beth sat at his kitchen table, staring at the documents Frank had carefully arranged before her. Her face grew paler with each photograph she examined. "Dear God," she whispered. "Robert tried to tell people, but no one would listen. Said he'd stolen proof of what they were doing, but the evidence disappeared when he died." She looked up at Frank. "How long have you had these?" "I found them yesterday, hidden in a room behind my basement wall." Beth nodded slowly. "That would be like Robert. Always said if anything happened to him, the truth would come out eventually." She picked up one of the photographs, her hand trembling. "This man here, I know him, Tommy Breslin. Went missing in the summer of '52. His family searched for months." Frank felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy blanket. These weren't just historical documents, they were evidence of murder. Frank's hands trembled as he spread the documents across his kitchen table, the morning light casting long shadows through the cabin's grimy windows. Each photograph, each memo, each classified report painted a picture more terrifying than anything he'd encountered in his 30 years as a history teacher. The Blackwater files weren't just about government corruption. They detailed a systematic program to eliminate anyone who got too close to certain historical truths. Names he recognized from textbooks labeled as suicides or accidents were listed with clinical precision alongside payment vouchers and operational summaries. His phone buzzed. "Unknown number. Professor Brennan?" The voice was crisp, professional. "This is Agent Sarah Chen, FBI. We need to talk." Frank's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sir, you're in immediate danger. We've been tracking the Blackwater network for 3 years. Your recent discovery has put you on their radar. How do you know about... Because we've been watching the cabin. We know about Harold Morrison's final message, and we know they're coming for you tonight. Frank peered through the window, suddenly aware of how isolated he was. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles down the mountain road. This is insane. I just bought a cabin. Mr. Morrison spent 15 years documenting their activities before they killed him. Made it look like a heart attack, but we know better. He was getting close to exposing Operation Nightfall. The name sent a chill down Frank's spine. He'd seen it referenced in several documents, but hadn't pieced together its significance. Listen carefully, Agent Chen continued. Pack only what you can carry, burn everything else. There's an old mining road behind your cabin. Follow it north for 2 miles. We'll extract you from there. Extract me? What is this, some kind of spy movie? Professor, in the last 40 years, 17 people have died because they learned what you know. Harold Morrison left those files specifically for someone like you, someone with the historical knowledge to understand their full implications. Frank stared at the documents scattered before him. Operation Nightfall appeared to be a decades-long program designed to suppress evidence of government involvement in major historical events. The Kennedy assassination was just the beginning. Watergate, Iran-Contra, even some terrorist attacks, all had footnotes suggesting official narrative management. Because if I were one of them, you'd already be dead. The line went quiet except for Frank's labored breathing. Through the window, he noticed a black SUV crawling up the mountain road, still distant but approaching steadily. They're here, he whispered. Get out now. Back door. Stay low. Frank stuffed the most damning documents into his jacket, his movements frantic but purposeful. These weren't just historical curiosities. They were death sentences. Morrison had known that, had designed the hidden room specifically to protect this information until the right person found it. He slipped out the back door, grateful for the dense pine forest that surrounded the cabin. Behind him, he heard car doors slam, then the splintering of wood as his front door was forced open. The mining road was overgrown and barely visible, but Frank's legs carried him forward with surprising strength for a man his age. Adrenaline was a hell of a drug. Behind him, voices echoed through the trees, calm, professional, deadly. 20 minutes later, breathing hard and bleeding from numerous scratches, Frank reached a clearing where Agent Chen waited beside an unmarked sedan. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 40, with intelligent eyes that had seen too much. "Get in," she said, already moving toward the driver's seat. As they pulled away, Frank looked back to see smoke rising from the direction of his cabin. "They're burning it." Standard procedure. Eliminate all traces. Chen navigated the rough road with practiced ease. "Professor, what you found represents the tip of something much larger. Morrison was our inside source before they discovered him." Inside source for what? A shadow organization that's been manipulating American history for decades. They call themselves the Custodians. Their job is to ensure certain truths never see daylight. Frank felt the weight of the documents in his jacket. And now they know I have this information. Which is why you can never go back to your old life. Frank Brennan, retired history teacher, died in that cabin fire tonight. At least that's what they'll believe. The implications hit him like a physical blow. His sister in Portland, his few remaining friends, the quiet retirement he'd planned, all gone because he'd stumbled into someone else's war. What happens now? Agent Chen's expression was grim as they reached the main highway. "Now you help us finish what Harold Morrison started. Because if we don't stop them, American democracy dies with us." In the distance, sirens wailed toward the burning cabin, but Frank knew it was already too late. His old life was ashes, and his new one promised only danger. The sound of tires on gravel jolted Frank from his fevered research. He'd been hunched over the documents for hours, cross-referencing names and dates until his eyes burned. The cabin's single window revealed headlights cutting through the mountain darkness. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. No one should know he was here. He'd told Martha he was visiting his cousin in Denver, and the nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a winding dirt road that barely qualified as passable. Moving quickly but quietly, he gathered the most damning documents, the photographs of the meeting, the financial records, the correspondence bearing official letterheads. The hidden room behind the bookshelf was too obvious now. If someone had come looking, they'd eventually find it. The engine noise grew closer. Frank stuffed the papers into a waterproof bag he'd found in the kitchen, then slipped out the back door into the frigid night air. The beam of his small flashlight barely penetrated the darkness as he stumbled toward the old storm cellar he'd discovered during his first week at the cabin. Behind him, car doors slammed. Multiple vehicles. Voices carried on the thin mountain air, low and urgent. Professional voices that spoke in clipped, efficient sentences. The storm cellar's wooden doors groaned as Frank pulled them open. The smell of damp earth and decay wafted up from below. He descended the rickety steps, pulling the doors closed above him just as the first flashlight beams swept across the backyard. In the suffocating darkness below ground, Frank pressed his back against the stone wall and tried to control his breathing. His phone had no signal this deep in the mountains, and even if it did, who would he call? The documents had made it clear that this conspiracy reached into the highest levels of government. Law enforcement might be compromised too. Footsteps thundered across the cabin's wooden floors above. Furniture scraped against walls. Voices shouted orders. Check every room. Look for loose floorboards, hidden panels, anything. Sir, we've got the main room torn apart. No sign of the materials. They have to be here. Our source was certain he'd found something. Frank's blood turned to ice. Their source. Someone had been watching him, reporting his activities. He thought back over the past weeks, trying to remember who he'd encountered. The elderly woman at the county records office, the librarian who'd helped him research property deeds, the teenager who'd delivered supplies from the hardware store. A new voice cut through the others, crisp with authority. Expand the search, check outbuildings, root cellars, anywhere he might have stashed them, and find Frank Morrison. He can't have gotten far. The storm cellar felt like a tomb. Frank fumbled in the darkness until his fingers found a shelf along the wall. Glass jars lined it, their contents long since spoiled. He pushed them aside and shoved the document bag behind them, then covered it with an old tarp that smelled of motor oil. The search above continued for what felt like hours. Frank heard them discover the hidden room, heard their frustrated curses when they found it empty. Eventually the sounds faded. Engines started. Vehicles drove away. But Frank waited. These weren't amateurs. They might leave someone behind, might be watching from the tree line. He counted to 1,000 twice before finally pushing open the cellar doors. The cabin was destroyed. Every piece of furniture had been overturned, every drawer dumped, every cushion sliced open. The hidden room gaped like an open wound behind the displaced bookshelf. They'd been thorough but not reckless. This was a professional intelligence operation, not a random break-in. Frank's hands shook as he surveyed the damage. 43 years of engineering problems had never prepared him for this. Give him a structural failure or a design flaw any day over shadowy government agents hunting him in the night. His truck was still in the driveway, untouched. They wanted him alive, wanted to know what he'd found and who he might have told. That gave him an advantage, but not much of one. He retrieved the documents from their hiding place and spread them across the kitchen table by lamplight. The conspiracy detailed in these papers was staggering in scope, a coordinated effort to manipulate public opinion, suppress evidence, and eliminate witnesses. And it was still active. The dates on some of the more recent correspondence were less than 5 years old. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents: Senator Catherine Welch, the current chairwoman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. She was scheduled to announce her presidential campaign next month. Frank stared at her signature on a document authorizing payment to eliminate potential security risks. The date was 6 months ago. This wasn't ancient history, it was ongoing, and he'd stumbled into the middle of it. He needed help, but from someone outside the system. Someone with the resources and credibility to expose this without getting killed in the process. His mind raced through possibilities as he packed the documents again. The cabin was no longer safe. But running blindly into the night wouldn't solve anything either. He needed a plan, and he needed allies. Frank looked out at the dark mountains surrounding him and made his decision. Frank's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph in his lap. The cabin's lamplight cast long shadows across the room, making the faces in the picture seem to shift and dance. He recognized 3 of them now: Senator Morrison, CIA Director Hayes, and the man he'd seen in countless history books, the same man whose assassination had changed everything. The sound of gravel crunching outside made his blood freeze. Car doors slammed in the darkness beyond his windows. Frank quickly gathered the documents, shoving them back into the metal box. His arthritic fingers fumbled with the latch as footsteps approached the front porch. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin. "Mr. Castellano, we'd like to have a word." Frank recognized the voice. Agent Morrison. Not the senator from the photographs, but his son, the federal agent who'd been tracking him. The irony wasn't lost on him that the son was now hunting down evidence of his father's crimes. "I know you're in there, Frank. Your truck's outside." Frank clutched the metal box and moved toward the hidden room. If he could just get the evidence back to its hiding place, maybe he could convince them he'd never found it. But as he pressed against the false wall panel, nothing happened. In his panic, he'd forgotten the sequence. The front door splintered open with a crash. Flashlight beams swept across the room as 3 figures entered. Frank pressed himself against the wall, the metal box clutched to his chest like armor. "There you are." Agent Morrison stepped into the lamplight, his weapon drawn but pointed downward. He looked tired, older than when Frank had first met him. "You've led us quite a chase. I don't know what you're talking about." Frank's voice sounded steadier than he felt. "The box, Frank. We know you found it." Morrison gestured to the other agents, who began searching the room. "My father spent 30 years making sure that information stayed buried. I'm not about to let some retired plumber from Detroit dig it back up." Frank's mind raced. "Your father was part of it. The conspiracy." Morrison's laugh was bitter. "Conspiracy? Is that what you think this is?" He holstered his weapon and sat heavily in Frank's reading chair. "My father was trying to prevent a nuclear war, Frank. In 1963, there were elements within our own government who wanted to use Dallas as justification for invading Cuba. The Bay of Pigs had failed, and they were looking for any excuse to finish the job. So they killed? They didn't kill anyone." Morrison's voice was sharp. "They covered up who really pulled the trigger because the truth would have started World War III. The real shooter was a Soviet operative, Frank. Moscow wanted chaos, wanted America tearing itself apart with conspiracy theories while they moved their chess pieces into position." Frank felt the world tilting beneath him. "That's impossible. The Warren Commission found exactly what they were supposed to find. A lone gunman with communist sympathies but American-born. Complicated enough to fuel decades of theories, but not so complicated that it pointed directly at the Kremlin." Morrison leaned forward. "My father and his colleagues made a choice. Let America blame itself, rather than risk nuclear annihilation." One of the other agents approached, whispering something in Morrison's ear. The agent nodded and stood up. "The thing is, Frank, that choice is still relevant today. Relations with Russia are complicated enough without some 70-year-old documents surfacing to muddy the waters. People in Washington, people in Moscow, they all benefit from keeping certain truths buried." Frank backed toward the wall, still clutching the box. "People have a right to know." "Do they? Do they have a right to know that their government has been lying to them for 60 years, that every conspiracy theorist was partially right, that would destroy faith in every institution we have?" Morrison's eyes were sad but determined. "Sometimes the truth is too dangerous, Frank, and sometimes the lie is more dangerous than the truth." The voice came from behind Frank. He spun around to see the false walls sliding open. Sarah emerged from the hidden room, followed by 2 men Frank didn't recognize. One wore a military uniform, the other an expensive suit. "Agent Morrison," Sarah said formally. "Colonel Hayes sends his regards." Morrison's face went white. "Hayes is dead, has been for 15 years. Director Hayes is very much alive," the man in the suit replied, though he's found retirement quite boring. When we learned that his old insurance policy had been discovered, he decided it was time to come out of the shadows. Frank looked between them, completely lost. Sarah? She turned to him with an apologetic smile. I'm sorry, Frank. My name isn't Sarah Chen. I'm Agent Hayes, CIA. And this conspiracy you've uncovered? It's about to get a lot more complicated. The box slipped from Frank's numb fingers, clattering to the floor. The dirt road seemed longer in the darkness, every pothole and rock jarring Frank's already frayed nerves. His headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the mountain night as he gripped the steering wheel, the manila envelope beside him containing enough evidence to topple governments. Behind him, the cabin, his refuge for the past month, was nothing but ashes and secrets. Margaret Chen had been right about one thing. There was no going back now. The GPS on his dashboard had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving him to navigate by memory through the winding mountain roads. He'd driven this route to town dozens of times, but everything looked different in the dark, more menacing. Every shadow could hide a sniper, every bend could reveal a roadblock. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Frank Miller? The voice was crisp, professional, with the faintest trace of an accent he couldn't place. Who is this? Someone who knew your father. We need to talk. Frank's blood chilled. My father's been dead for 30 years. Has he? The line went dead. Frank stared at the phone, his hands trembling. The envelope seemed to pulse beside him like a living thing, its contents suddenly feeling heavier than lead. Inside were photocopies of documents that proved Operation Blackwater had never ended. It had simply evolved, its tentacles reaching into every level of government, finance, and media. But now, someone was claiming his father was alive. Frank pulled over at a scenic overlook, his truck's engine ticking in the sudden silence. Below him, the valley spread out like a black ocean, dotted with the occasional light. He opened the envelope with shaking fingers and rifled through the papers until he found what he was looking for, the personnel files Margaret had photographed. A set of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror, moving slowly up the mountain road. Frank's pulse quickened. The vehicle pulled into the overlook behind him, a black SUV with tinted windows. Frank reached for his keys, but a tap on his passenger window made him freeze. A figure stood outside, backlit by the SUV's headlights. The man was tall, wearing a dark coat, his face obscured by shadow. Mr. Miller? The voice was muffled by the glass. I'm unarmed. We just need to talk. Against every instinct screaming at him to flee, Frank rolled down the window an inch. About what? About why your father's funeral had an empty casket. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. That's impossible. Is it? You were 12 years old. You saw what they wanted you to see. The man stepped closer, and Frank caught a glimpse of his face, weathered, mid-60s, with intelligent grey eyes. Your father didn't die in that helicopter crash in Nicaragua. He discovered what Operation Blackwater really was, and he tried to expose it, so they made him disappear. You're lying. Am I? Then how do you explain this? The man held up a photograph. Even in the dim light, Frank could see it clearly, his father, unmistakably alive, standing next to a much younger version of the man outside his window. The timestamp read 1997, 10 years after the supposed funeral. Frank's world tilted. Where is he now? Dead. For real this time. They found him 3 years ago living under an assumed name in Costa Rica, but before they killed him, he managed to send something to his old friend here, me, something he'd been working on for decades. The man reached into his coat, and Frank tensed, but he only pulled out another envelope. Your father spent 30 years documenting everything, every name, every operation, every crime. He called it his insurance policy. He always hoped that someday his son might be in a position to finish what he started. Why should I trust you? Because I'm the one who's been leaving you those warnings. I've been watching over you since you bought that cabin, trying to keep you alive long enough to get his message. The man's expression softened. Your father talked about you constantly. He was so proud when you became a teacher, said you'd inherited his sense of justice. Frank stared at the envelope in the man's hand. What's in there? The locations of 7 buried caches across the country. Your father hid physical evidence, documents, recordings, photographs that prove Operation Blackwater orchestrated assassinations, rigged elections, and funded foreign wars for profit. The material you found in that cabin was just the tip of the iceberg. A distant rumble echoed through the mountains, helicopters still far off but getting closer. "They've found us," the man said urgently. "Take this. Your father's final instructions are inside, along with contact information for a journalist he trusted. Whatever you do, don't go home. They'll be waiting." Frank grabbed the envelope just as the helicopter searchlights swept across the valley below. "Go!" the man shouted, already running back to his SUV. "Remember, your father died believing you could finish this. Don't let him down." The fire crackled in the hearth as Frank spread the photographs across his kitchen table, his hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from the weight of what he'd discovered. The faces staring back at him from the black and white images were younger versions of men he recognized from history books, but they wore expressions he'd never seen in those sanitized official portraits. Calculating, predatory, conspiratorial. Senator Joseph McCarthy sat beside a man Frank now knew was Heinrich Müller, the former Gestapo chief, who was supposed to have died in Berlin. Between them lay documents bearing Nazi insignia and what appeared to be lists of names, American names. Frank picked up his reading glasses and studied the photograph more closely. In the background, partially obscured by shadow, stood another figure. The jawline was familiar, the posture distinctly military. Frank grabbed a magnifying glass from his junk drawer and held it over the image. His blood ran cold. General Douglas MacArthur. Frank set down the magnifying glass and reached for his coffee, surprised to find his cup empty. He couldn't remember drinking it. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times, its deep resonance echoing through the cabin like a death knell. A sound outside made him freeze. It was subtle, the soft crunch of snow under careful footsteps. Frank killed the overhead light and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. The moon cast long shadows across the snow-covered clearing, but nothing moved. Still, the silence felt wrong, too complete, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. He gathered the photographs and documents quickly, stuffing them back into the manila envelope. His mind raced through options. The hidden room was no longer safe. If they'd found him, they'd search everywhere. The truck was too obvious. But the old root cellar behind the cabin, half collapsed and forgotten, might buy him time. Frank pulled on his coat and boots, tucked the envelope inside his jacket, and slipped out the back door. The cold bit at his exposed skin as he made his way carefully through the snow, each step deliberate and quiet. Behind him, the warm glow from his kitchen windows painted golden rectangles on the white ground. The root cellar door groaned softly as he lifted it. The space below was cramped and musty, filled with the detritus of decades, broken mason jars, rotted wooden shelves, the lingering scent of long-forgotten preserves. Frank wrapped the envelope in an old canvas tarp and wedged it behind a pile of collapsed lumber where the shadows were deepest. As he climbed back up, he heard the unmistakable sound of his front door opening. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. Frank closed the cellar door and crept toward the cabin, staying low behind the woodpile. Through the kitchen window, he could see 2 figures moving through his living room with practiced efficiency. They weren't ransacking the place. This was a professional search, methodical and thorough. One of them said something to the other, but Frank couldn't make out the words. The second figure nodded and headed toward the bedroom, while the first continued examining the kitchen table where the photographs had been spread just minutes earlier. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs. If he'd been 30 years younger, he might have tried to run, to disappear into the wilderness until he could figure out his next move. But at 67, in below-freezing temperatures, that was suicide. Besides, they'd find the hidden room eventually. When they did, they'd know he'd seen everything. The smart play was to go back inside and act innocent, pretend he'd been asleep, claim ignorance about any documents or photographs. but as Frank watched the systematic way they moved through his home, he knew that wouldn't work. These weren't men who would be fooled by an old man's protestations of innocence. The figure in the kitchen moved toward the back door. Frank pressed himself against the woodpile, hardly daring to breathe. Snow began to fall again, light flakes that caught the moonlight like tiny stars. In different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. The back door opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch. Frank could see him clearly now, mid-40s, military-bearing, wearing a dark coat that probably cost more than Frank's truck. The man's breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he scanned the yard with the patience of a predator. After what felt like an eternity, the man went back inside. Frank remained hidden behind the woodpile, watching his own home being violated by ghosts from a war that was supposed to be over. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd bought this cabin to escape the complexities of the modern world, only to stumble into secrets that could topple governments. The question now was whether he'd live long enough to tell anyone about them. "Don't say a word, just listen," came a voice he didn't recognize. Gravelly, older, with a slight southern accent. "They know you have the documents, get out." Now, the line went dead. Frank sat up in bed, his mind instantly clear despite the hour. Through his bedroom window he could see the cabin's perimeter bathed in pale moonlight. Everything looked normal, but the caller's urgency had sent ice through his veins. As he pulled on his boots, a sound made him freeze. The soft crunch of gravel under tires, engines turned off, vehicles coasting. Frank crept to the front window and peered through a gap in the curtains. 3 black SUVs sat at the bottom of his driveway, their occupants already moving up the slope on foot. Even in the dim light he could see they wore tactical gear and carried weapons. Frank's escape plan had always been through the back of the cabin, into the dense forest that stretched for miles toward the next valley. He slung the document bag across his chest and eased open the rear door, grateful he'd oiled the hinges just last week. The mountain air was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Frank moved as quietly as his aging joints would allow, using the shadows of the larger trees for cover. Behind him, he heard the splintering of wood as they breached his front door. Shouts erupted from the cabin. "Clear! Nothing here! Check the hidden room!" Frank pushed deeper into the forest, following a deer trail he discovered during his first week at the cabin. His retirement hiking had paid off. His legs were strong, his breathing steady despite the elevation and adrenaline. 20 minutes later, he heard the dogs. The baying echoed off the mountain slopes, growing closer. Frank's blood chilled. He'd prepared for many contingencies, but not tracking dogs. His scent trail would lead them straight to him. He needed water, a stream to break the trail. Frank changed direction, heading toward the sound of running water he could hear somewhere to his left. The terrain grew rougher, forcing him to use his hands to navigate the steep, rocky slope. The creek was smaller than he'd hoped, barely 3 feet wide, but it would have to do. Frank waded upstream, the icy water soaking through his boots and numbing his feet. Every step was treacherous, on the slippery rocks, but the dogs' voices were getting closer. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, Frank spotted something that made his heart leap. An old mining tunnel carved into the hillside, its entrance partially hidden by fallen rocks and overgrown vegetation. He climbed out of the creek and scrambled up the embankment. The tunnel mouth was just wide enough for a man to enter. Frank squeezed through the opening, using his phone's flashlight to illuminate the passage beyond. The tunnel stretched back into darkness, supported by rotting timber beams that had somehow held for decades. The air was stale and cold, but it was shelter. More importantly, it would hide his scent and provide time to think. Frank made his way carefully into the tunnel, testing each step. About 50 feet in, the passage opened into a wider chamber where miners had once extracted ore from the mountain's belly. He settled against the far wall and allowed himself to breathe. His phone showed no signal, which was both frustrating and reassuring. If he couldn't call for help, at least they couldn't track him electronically. The documents pressed against his chest, a constant reminder of why men with guns were hunting him through the mountains. The evidence he'd uncovered in his cabin's hidden room was apparently worth killing for. Proof of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, involving the assassination of a president and the cover-up that followed. Frank had been naive to think he could simply turn the evidence over to the authorities. The conspiracy was too deep, too well protected. The very people he might have trusted were likely part of the machine that had kept these secrets buried for 50 years. Outside, he could hear the dogs getting closer, their handlers calling commands. Frank pressed deeper into the mine, hoping it had another exit. As he moved, his flashlight beam caught something that made him stop. Fresh footprints in the dust. Someone else had been here recently. A voice spoke from the darkness ahead of him. "Mr. Morrison, I'm the one who called you. We need to talk." The safe house wasn't much to look at. A squat brick building wedged between a laundromat and a Vietnamese restaurant in Arlington. Frank followed Agent Sarah Chen through a nondescript door marked only with an address number, his laptop bag clutched against his chest like armor. The events of the past 48 hours felt surreal. The gunfight at his cabin, the desperate flight through the mountains, and now this sterile room with its fluorescent lights and government-issued furniture. "Coffee?" Chen asked, gesturing toward a machine that had seen better decades. Frank shook his head. His hands were still trembling slightly, though he wasn't sure if it was from adrenaline or the 3 cups he'd already consumed. "I need to know what happens next." Chen settled into a chair across from him, her expression grave. "We've been tracking the Prometheus group for 6 years. What you found in that cabin, those documents are the missing pieces we've been searching for." "The Prometheus group?" That's what they call themselves now. Started as a handful of CIA operatives and defense contractors in 1963, right after Kennedy announced his intention to withdraw from Vietnam. They believed the president was compromising national security, that his policies would lead to communist expansion across Southeast Asia. Frank opened his laptop, the screen still displaying the scanned documents he'd photographed in the hidden room. So they killed him. Not directly. But they orchestrated the cover-up, manipulated the investigation, and eliminated witnesses. Your predecessor, the man who owned that cabin, was one of the few who escaped their initial purge. The weight of it settled on Frank's shoulders like a lead blanket. Thomas Hartley. That was his name, wasn't it? The original owner. Chen nodded. Thomas Hartley, CIA communications specialist. He discovered the plot 3 days before Dallas, tried to warn his superiors. Instead, he found himself marked for termination. He disappeared, assumed dead for 60 years. Frank scrolled through the documents on his screen. Meeting notes, payment records, photographs of men in dark suits shaking hands in shadowy rooms. These show payments continuing into the 1970s, 1980s. They didn't stop with Kennedy. No, they didn't. RFK, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, anyone who threatened their vision of American power. The group evolved, adapted, grew more sophisticated. By the 1990s, they had people in the Pentagon, the CIA, major corporations. They became the shadow government conspiracy theorists always claimed existed. A chill ran down Frank's spine. And they're still active. Very much so. The men who attacked your cabin work for a private security firm called Blackwater Solutions, a front company. We estimate the group has assets in the hundreds of millions, maybe billions. They've been patient, strategic, playing the long game. Frank stood and walked to the small window overlooking the street below. Normal people going about their normal lives, unaware that everything they believed about their country's history was built on lies. What do they want now? The same thing they've always wanted: control. The documents in your cabin contain names, dates, financial records spanning 6 decades. If this goes public, it would bring down administrations, topple governments, expose corruption at the highest levels of American power. Then why didn't Hartley release them years ago? Chen joined him at the window. He tried, twice. Both times people died. His wife, his brother, a journalist he'd contacted. Eventually he realized the only way to stay alive was to disappear completely. He's been hiding in that cabin for decades, waiting for the right moment, the right person. And he thought I was that person. Maybe. Or maybe he just ran out of time. Chen turned back to the laptop. We found his body yesterday morning, Frank, in a nursing home in Asheville, registered under a false name. Natural causes, but the timing suggests he knew something was coming. Frank felt a stab of grief for a man he'd never met, but whose legacy now rested in his hands. The real estate agent, she was working for them? Almost certainly. They've been monitoring property sales in that area for years, waiting for someone to buy the cabin. When you showed up, Chen shrugged, you became a threat that needed elimination. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and distant traffic. Frank stared at the laptop screen, at decades of secrets that had cost so many lives. What are my options? You could disappear, new identity, relocation, protection, live quietly somewhere and let sleeping dogs lie. Or help us bring them down. Testify before a grand jury, work with our investigation team, see this through to the end. Chen's voice hardened. Fair warning, if you choose that path, your life will never be the same. These people don't forgive, and they don't forget. Frank thought of his small apartment back in Milwaukee, his quiet retirement plans, the simple life he'd imagined. All of that seemed impossibly distant now, like looking at someone else's dream through frosted glass. He closed the laptop and turned to face Chen. How do we start? Frank's hands trembled as he stared at the documents spread across his kitchen table. The morning sun streamed through the cabin windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the dark truth emerging from the yellowed pages. 3 sleepless nights had passed since his confrontation with Marcus Webb, and the weight of what he'd discovered pressed down on him like a physical force. The assassination files weren't just about Kennedy. They detailed a systematic dismantling of American democracy that had been orchestrated for decades. Names of senators, judges, and corporate executives filled the margins, some crossed out in red ink, others circled in what Frank now understood was a kill list that spanned generations. Dad, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours. There's something you need to know. Frank's chest tightened. What is it? I did some digging on that Marcus Webb you mentioned. Dad, he doesn't exist. Not officially. No birth certificate, no social security number, nothing before 1975. But I found something else. Her voice dropped to a whisper. 3 people who've researched similar conspiracy theories in the past 5 years have died in accidents. Car crashes, house fires, heart attacks. The coffee mug slipped from Frank's grip, shattering against the floor. Sarah, you need to stop looking into this. Delete everything you've found and forget we ever talked about it. Dad, what aren't you telling me? Through the window, Frank spotted movement in the tree line. A glint of metal caught the sunlight. Binoculars or a rifle scope. His blood turned to ice. Sarah, listen carefully. Take the kids and go to your mother's place in Phoenix. Today. Don't pack, just leave. You're scaring me. Good. Stay scared. It'll keep you alive. He ended the call and grabbed the documents, stuffing them into the waterproof bag he'd prepared. The hidden room had served its purpose, but now it was compromised. Webb's people would be coming, and this time they wouldn't underestimate a 67-year-old retiree. Frank's military training kicked in as he moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. He'd already established 3 escape routes and cached supplies at 2 locations in the surrounding forest. The years might have slowed his body, but his mind remained sharp. A vehicle rumbled up the mountain road, too early for the mail carrier, too heavy for a passenger car. Frank peered through the curtains and saw a black SUV approaching, followed by a second vehicle. 4 men emerged, dressed in tactical gear that suggested they weren't planning to ask polite questions. He slipped out the back door as the first man reached the front porch. The forest embraced him like an old friend, decades of hunting experience guiding his steps as he moved silently through the underbrush. Behind him, he heard the splintering of wood as they kicked in his door. The first cache was a quarter-mile uphill, hidden beneath a fallen log he'd marked months ago. Inside the waterproof container were a satellite phone, cash, a pistol, and fake identification documents he'd acquired through old military contacts who operated in grey legal areas. As he retrieved the items, voices echoed from the cabin below. They were searching systematically, professionally. These weren't the same incompetent operatives who'd been watching him before. Webb had escalated. Frank dialed a number he'd memorized but hoped never to use. Jensen. Ray, it's Frank Morrison. I need to call in that favor. A pause. Jesus, Frank. I heard you were dead. Not yet, but it's on the agenda. I've got something that certain people want buried along with me. What kind of something? The kind that explains why 3 presidents changed their foreign policy overnight. Why certain senators suddenly reversed their positions on military spending, and why the official story of November 22nd, 1963 has more holes than Swiss cheese. Another pause, longer this time. Where are you? Colorado. They've got professional hunters tracking me. Can you make it to Denver? Frank calculated the distance, the terrain, and his dwindling options. Maybe. There's a reporter at the Post, investigative type. Name's Catherine Chen. She's been asking uncomfortable questions about some of the same people you're probably running from. If anyone can get this story out before they silence you permanently, it's her. Ray. Frank, whatever you've stumbled into, it's bigger than both of us. But Chen has protection, resources, and most importantly, she's already a target. Might as well make their efforts worthwhile. The line went dead. Below, Frank could see flashlight beams moving through the trees. They'd found his escape route faster than expected. He shouldered the bag containing the documents and started moving deeper into the wilderness. Denver was 150 miles away, and between him and the city stood some of the most unforgiving terrain in Colorado. But he'd survived worse odds before, and this time he wasn't just fighting for his own life. The truth had waited 60 years in that hidden room. It could wait a few more days. The steel door groaned on its hinges as Frank pushed it open, the sound echoing through the underground chamber like a death rattle. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals that hummed with electrical life. The air tasted metallic, recycled through hidden ventilation systems that had been operating in secret for decades. "Jesus Christ," whispered Agent Sarah Chen, her weapon drawn as she swept the room behind Frank. "How long has this been here?" Frank's weathered hands trembled as he approached the nearest terminal. The screen displayed a real-time satellite feed of Washington, D.C., with tracking markers moving across the map like digital chess pieces, long enough to kill a lot of good people who got too close. The sound of footsteps echoed from the tunnel behind them. Frank spun around to see Director Harrison emerge from the shadows, his face pale but determined. Behind him came 3 other agents, their tactical gear making them look like soldiers rather than federal investigators. "Frank, step away from those computers," Harrison commanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "This is bigger than you understand." "I understand plenty," Frank shot back, gesturing at the walls lined with photographs and documents. "I understand that Operation Blackwater never ended. I understand that my brother died because he found out about this place. And I understand that you've been part of it from the beginning." Harrison's shoulders sagged as if carrying an invisible weight. "Your brother was a patriot, Frank. He died protecting something larger than himself. He died because you couldn't let the truth come out." Frank's finger hovered over a keyboard. "These files contain evidence of assassination plots, election interference, foreign agent networks, all operating under the protection of people like you." Agent Chen kept her weapon trained on Harrison while stealing glances at the screens around them. One monitor displayed bank routing numbers and cryptocurrency wallets containing millions of dollars. Another showed a list of names Frank recognized from newspaper headlines: senators, judges, business leaders. "The cabin was never abandoned," Frank continued, pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. "It was a safe house. A place where your people could access this bunker without drawing attention. That's why the previous owner disappeared. That's why the price was so low. You needed someone to buy it who wouldn't ask questions. Harrison stepped closer, his hand moving slowly toward his jacket. We needed a caretaker, someone isolated, someone who'd maintain the property without realizing what lay beneath it. Your military background, your financial situation, your need for solitude, you were perfect. Except I found the hidden room. That was unfortunate. The entrance should have been better concealed. Frank's laugh was bitter. Unfortunate for you, maybe. My brother's journal led me right to it. He knew you'd try to bury this place forever, so he left breadcrumbs. The terminal beside Frank chimed softly, displaying an incoming message. His blood ran cold as he read the text, package delivered to Washington address. Awaiting confirmation of target elimination. There's an active operation happening right now, Frank said, his voice tight with urgency. Someone's about to be killed. Harrison's expression hardened. Step away from those computers, Frank. That's not a request. Instead, Frank began typing rapidly, his fingers moving across the keyboard with surprising agility. I'm sending everything to every news outlet I can reach. The whole conspiracy, all the files, every dirty secret you've been protecting. You'll destroy national security operations that have kept this country safe for 50 years. I'll expose the cancer that's been eating away at our democracy. Frank's voice echoed off the concrete walls. My brother understood that some secrets are too dangerous to keep. Agent Chen immediately shifted her aim to Harrison. Sir, put your weapon down. We can resolve this without violence. You don't understand, Chen. The people who run this operation, they're not just criminals hiding in shadows. They're embedded throughout the government, the military, the intelligence community. If these files go public, it won't just expose the guilty, it'll tear apart every institution we have. Frank continued typing, upload progress bars crawling across multiple screens. Maybe those institutions deserve to be torn apart if they're built on lies and murder. A new sound emerged from the tunnels, multiple sets of footsteps moving fast. Harrison's radio crackled with urgent voices reporting breaches at surface entrances. More agents were arriving, but Frank couldn't tell if they were coming to help or to silence everyone who'd seen too much. Upload complete, Frank announced, stepping back from the terminal. Every major news organization now has copies of everything. Even if you kill me, the truth is already out there. Harrison lowered his weapon slightly, defeat flickering across his weathered features. You have no idea what you've just unleashed. Outside, the mountain wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the sound of approaching helicopters. Frank looked around the underground chamber one last time, thinking of his brother and all the others who died to protect these secrets. Now it was time for the world to decide what to do with the truth. The helicopter's rotors beat against the mountain air as Frank watched it disappear over the ridge, taking Senator Harrison and his surviving associates into federal custody. The silence that followed felt profound after weeks of paranoia and violence. Frank stood on his porch, Martha's arm linked through his, both of them still processing that it was finally over. 63 years, Martha said quietly. That conspiracy ran for 63 years. Frank nodded, thinking of the documents now in FBI hands, evidence of election rigging, vote buying, and political manipulation stretching back to 1960. The hidden room beneath his cabin had contained the complete records of Operation Mandate, a shadow organization that had influenced every presidential election since Kennedy's narrow victory. Harrison's grandfather had been one of the founding members. Agent Rodriguez approached them, her phone finally silent after hours of coordinating arrests across multiple states. We've got confirmation from Washington. 12 high-ranking officials taken into custody, including 2 current cabinet members and a Supreme Court justice. This is going to reshape American politics for generations. Frank felt the weight of history settling around them. His simple retirement cabin had become ground zero for the biggest political scandal in American history. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd bought this place to escape the complexity of modern life, only to uncover its darkest secrets. What happens now? Martha asked. Congressional hearings, criminal trials, constitutional crises, Rodriguez replied. And you two will be the star witnesses. I hope you're prepared for that level of scrutiny. Frank squeezed Martha's hand. They discussed this during the long night while waiting for the FBI to secure the area. Their quiet retirement was over, replaced by something far more significant but infinitely more dangerous. Even with Harrison captured, there would be others, powerful people whose careers and freedoms now hung in the balance. We knew this was bigger than us when we decided to go public, Frank said. Some things are worth the risk. Over the next hour, crime scene technicians carefully documented and removed every piece of evidence from the hidden room. Frank watched them work, thinking about old Henry Castellano, the cabin's previous owner who died protecting these secrets. The man had lived with this burden for decades, too frightened to speak but too patriotic to destroy the evidence. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived as the last of the documents were being loaded into secure vehicles. The historian looked exhausted but exhilarated as she surveyed the scene. Frank, what you've uncovered here will require rewriting entire chapters of American political history, she said. Every close election since 1960 will need to be re-examined. Kennedy, Nixon, Carter, Bush, Obama, Trump, we'll have to analyze them all through this new lens. Frank found himself thinking not about the grand historical implications, but about the human cost. How many legitimate candidates had been denied office? How many policies had been shaped by this shadow influence? How many Americans had lived their entire lives under a partially fraudulent democracy? As afternoon faded into evening, the federal agents finally departed, leaving Frank and Martha alone with their transformed property. The cabin looked the same from the outside, but everything had changed. The hidden room stood open now, its secrets exposed to daylight for the first time in over 6 decades. Martha began preparing dinner, while Frank walked the perimeter of his property, checking for any remaining signs of Harrison's surveillance equipment. The mountains felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a monument to the complex realities of power and corruption. His phone rang. Agent Rodriguez's voice was tense. Frank, we've got a problem. Harrison's lawyer is claiming prosecutorial misconduct. He's saying the evidence was obtained through illegal search and seizure, that you had no right to access that room. Frank's stomach tightened. What does that mean? It means this fight isn't over. They're going to challenge everything in court. The defense will argue that Henry Castellano was a mentally unstable conspiracy theorist and that the documents are forgeries. Without ironclad chain of custody, some of this evidence might not be admissible. Frank looked back at his cabin, understanding finally settling over him. The physical danger might be past, but the real battle was just beginning. This wouldn't be resolved by shootouts and dramatic arrests. It would be decided by lawyers and judges and the complex machinery of justice. We'll be ready, he told Rodriguez. That night, Frank and Martha sat on their porch watching stars emerge over the mountains. The cabin creaked in the wind, familiar sounds that had once promised peace, but now served as reminders of hidden secrets and dangerous truths. Any regrets? Martha asked. Frank considered the question seriously. His simple retirement had become a crusade for democratic integrity. Their future would be defined by courtrooms and congressional hearings rather than quiet mountain mornings. No, he said finally. Some responsibilities choose you. The mountains held their silence, and Frank understood that his real work was just beginning.